In this video, we're going to talk about how to find the equation of a circle by completing the square, right? Because in the first video, we talked about the fact that equations of a circle follow the format x minus x1 all squared plus y minus y1 all squared, and that's equal to radius squared, right? So essentially, we can get three things from this formula. The first thing is your x1 is the x coordinate of your center. Your y1 is the y coordinate of your center. And then your r is your radius, right? So your r in this case is going to be the radius. Right, so we know how to basically interpret when given this format. But as I mentioned in the last video, they don't usually, right, give you the circle in this format, right? You should be able to be given it in an expanded form. So what I mean by expanded form is I can take this bracket, multiply it out. I can take this bracket, multiply it out, simplify, and then in that case, then ask you about the properties of a circle, which means you need to write it in this format first, and then be able to tell, okay, what's the center, what's the radius, right? So that's a bunch of words, right? What exactly do I mean? So what I mean is this, right? So I'm going to explain what I mean using an example, right? So we're going to jump straight into the example. It's going to be example 1. Now, this is going to be the example at the end that we used at the end of the last video, where we started it off in this format, we expanded it, and when we expanded it, right, it ended up with x squared minus 2x plus y squared plus 4y, and that's equal to 4, right? So now we're saying, okay, we now need to find a way to write this equation in this format, which means, so just looking at this format has two brackets that have been expanded. You have the x bracket. So maybe, for example, this is something like x plus 1 squared, right? So where you have x squared plus 2x plus 1. So essentially, all your x terms belong to this bracket. Same thing with the y, right? Because the y also expanded. So all your y terms belong to the y bracket. And then the tricky thing is we don't know where because once you simplify, if my y was also y plus 1 squared, right? This is also like you have an x squared term and you know, a y squared term, a y term, and then you have the 1. Right, but then when you simplify, this one from this bracket and the one from that bracket also add up. So you don't know out of the constants, and the only constant we have in this case is the 4. You don't know how much of this came from the y's, how much it came from the x's. So what we're going to do is we're going to deal with the x's on their own. We're going to deal with the y's on their own, and then try to simplify the equation from that point. All right, so this is how we're going to do it, right? So we're going to use completing the square. Now, what is completing the square? So we're going to start off with the x's. Your x's are x squared minus 2x, right? We are trying to write it in the form x minus something all squared, or x plus something all squared. So that process is called completing the square, where you take it in quadratic form, which is usually in the form ax squared plus bx plus c, and you're trying to turn it into x minus something squared. This process is called completing the square. So the steps that we're going to try to follow, right? Hopefully this is not too confusing. And at this point, the assumption here is that you've gone through quadratics and you are somewhat comfortable with completing the square. So hopefully the steps that I'm going to take aren't too confusing. If you've got a different method that you'd like to try, you can go ahead and try that. But as long as you come to the same answer that we do in this video. All right. So the steps that we're going to follow are this. The first thing is we want to make sure that our a, so remember the a is the thing that's attached to your x squared. We want to make sure that that's 1. And we can see it's 1, so that's perfectly fine. So we don't need to do anything. The next step we need to take is, okay, since this is 1, we need to now identify our b value, right? So our b value is whatever is attached to your x. So in this case, it's the -2. So your b is actually equal to -2. All right. And I am now then going to identify a b over 2, which is negative 2 over 2, and that's equal to negative 1. All right. So in the steps that I follow is you first identify your b value. You divide that value by 2. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take this expression, the expression we had at the beginning, which is x squared minus 2x. And then you're going to add and subtract the square of your answer here. So we are going to add the square, which is negative 1, but also subtract it as well. And why we do this is because essentially what it does is these first 3 terms that we now have over here can now be compressed into one bracket that's being squared, right? It can now be compressed into whatever's being squared over there, which is your x, and then whatever's being squared over there, which is your negative 1 squared. You can actually try expand this bracket and see if it gives you the same answer, right? But essentially, once we introduce this over here, that means this can now be brought into one bracket. Hopefully that's not too, it's not too bad, right? But again, if you have a different method of completing the square, you can go ahead and use that method. Okay, so, but that's just those first three. But remember, we added, which we've already dealt with that, but we also subtracted this term over here. So we also need to make sure that we write it because we haven't really done anything with that yet. So that's going to be minus negative 1 squared is positive 1. So that's going to be minus 1. So that means this term, x squared minus 2x, basically simplified to x minus 1 squared minus 1. We're going to follow exactly the same steps with the y's, right? So with the y's, we're going to have, right? So maybe this time I'm going to go a little bit quicker, right? So your y's start off as y squared plus 4y. What we're going to do is make sure that the a is 1, which it is, perfect. But now here are the confusing steps, right? Where we say, okay, what's our b value? Our b value is positive 4, which means half of that would be positive 4 over 2, which is positive 2. Okay, cool. So the next thing we then want to do is add and subtract the square of that answer. So we're going to say y squared plus 4y plus the square of that minus the square of that. All right, so you add the square of positive 2, you subtract the square of positive 2. All right, so what that does, again, it does exactly the same thing that it did from before, is these first 3 terms are then going to compress into whatever's being squared over there, which is y, whatever's being squared over there, which is positive 2 squared. And then you still have this. You still have minus positive 2 squared is positive 4, so you still have minus 4. Okay, so let's get back to our initial problem. Our initial problem was x squared minus 2x, right? But we know that instead of having x squared minus 2x, we can actually now write it as, because we said x squared minus 2x is actually equal to this. So we're going to say, we're going to replace x squared minus 2x with x minus 1 all squared minus 1. Then we still have plus, right? We still have y squared plus 4y. But instead of having y squared plus 4y, remember we can also write y squared plus 4y as this. So we can write it as y plus 2 squared minus 4. And then that equation was also equal to negative 4. So we can write it like this. So now we can just simplify, right? So now we can write it as x minus 1 squared. Right, so we're going to take our constants. You're going to take the negative 1 to that side. You're going to take the negative 4 to that side as well. So what you're left with on the left-hand side is you've got x minus 1. You have y plus 2, right? And these are both squared. But on this side, I think this was positive 4. On this side, you have 4. The negative 4 comes to that side and becomes positive 4. The negative 1 goes to that side and becomes positive 1. Right, so we still have x plus 1 squared plus, no, that's x minus 1. All right, x minus 1 squared plus y plus 2 squared is equal to 4 plus 4 is 8 plus 1. That gives you 9. So we have successfully turned it from this format into this format over here, right? And in this format, we can much more easily interpret the circle. We can tell that, okay, because remember, this is supposed to be x minus something, right? That something is the x coordinate of your center. So what's the thing that we're subtracting here, right? Since it's x minus 1, that means your x value, your x1 value is positive 1. Or if this is tricky, you can just basically just write this as a x minus 1 is equal to x minus 1. X minus x1 is x minus 1. These x's are going to cancel. And then you're left with negative x1 is equal to negative 1. So that means your x1 is equal to negative 1. So if you want to write it this way, you can, right? If the signs get confusing. But essentially, this tells us that your x1 is positive 1. Same with the y's, right? So the y's are also supposed to be y minus 1. The problem is, if you have positive 2, what are you subtracting, right? So what does y1 have to be for this to end up being positive? It actually has to end up being a negative value, because if it's y minus negative 2, this does give you y plus 2. So that means your y1 value is actually negative 2. But again, if this is confusing, we can interpret it by saying this: y minus y1, right? So we're looking for y minus y1, but what you're given is y plus 2, all right? So let's solve for y1. The y's are going to cancel, right? Because if I take the y this side, it becomes y minus y. Those two can always cancel, all right? Cool. So y's cancel, and you're left with negative y is equal to positive 2. Negative y1 is equal to positive 2, rather. Then you can divide both sides by the negative to give you y1 is equal to negative 2. So if the signs get confusing, because we said for the signs, to interpret this, if there's a negative, it means that your x is positive. If there is a positive, it means that it's negative, right? So it's always going to be the reverse, but sometimes that's a little confusing. So if it does get confusing, you can always just write it out. Just do whatever it is that will give you the marks, that will get you comfortable enough to score the marks and to be able to understand what's going on. So essentially, that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be completing the square in order for us to get the equation from this expanded format into here, where we can interpret. Actually, we're not done here, actually, because we said we got the x coordinate of your center, the y coordinate of your center, but we still need the radius, because this value is your radius squared, right? Remember, it's in the form this bracket squared, that bracket squared is equal to r squared. So your 9 is actually the radius squared. So in order for us to find the actual radius, we need to square root. So that means your radius is going to be the square root of 9, which is 3. It's actually usually positive and negative 3, but because you can't have a negative radius, we just take the positive value. So we can much more easily interpret the circle, right, when it's in this format. But we need to do a little bit of work using completing the square to get it looking from this right up until the point where it looks like this. So we'll look at a lot more examples as we're doing exam videos, but hopefully for now this makes sense and it wasn't too confusing with the completing the square. And